So just a quick poll before I start. I said this is for developers. Hands up if you're a developer. Loads of devs. Hands up if you're not. Keep your hands up if you have zero technical background whatsoever. There's a couple of people, a few people. Okay, don't worry, you're going to be able to follow this talk. It's not very technical. I focused this on devs. What I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about Cynefin. I'm going to cover a thing which I'm calling capability red, which is a thing I've been doing for a while, but I've put a little bit of a brand around it because it's stuff that's a little bit different to what's happening out there. And if you look on my blog, you can find there's a category called capability red, so all the stuff I'm going to be talking about is on that blog. And I'm going to show you how it relates to BDD as well. So just to give you a bit of an idea about what we're talking about, hands up if you've heard of Cynefin. Hands up if you haven't. Hands up if you didn't put your hands up. Not too many. Okay. So why for the devs? For me, I used to be a dev, and I wish I had had this stuff back when I was a dev. I think of all the people that I've been teaching this to, the devs are the ones who've benefited most. This has really made a difference to the way that they've been able to approach problems and the power that they've had to suggest solutions. And to actually play back with the analysts. It's brought teams together very strongly. It's helped people to avoid that whole weekend and evening overtime work that the devs always seem to get stuck with. So I really wanted to share it particularly with the devs today, but it's going to be relevant for a lot of people. Okay, so first of all, Cynefin. The hardest thing about Cynefin is pronouncing it. It's spelled Cynefin, as you can see, Cynefin. Yeah. It really started for me with this book. So this is Tom DeMarco and Timothy Lister's Waltzing with Bears. It's a very small book. It's about risk on software projects, and it starts on chapter 1 with this little quote in a box: if a project has no risks, don't do it. And the reason is, if we were going to do a project which had absolutely no risks involved, it would have to be the same project we've already done, with the same people and the same technology and the same requirements. And that would never happen. Because if we were going to do that, we've already got that thing. We already know how to do that thing. Why would we ever want to do something like that again? So every single thing that we do in software, and not just in software, has some aspect to it that's new. Some aspect that makes it exciting. But it's also where the risk is. So it's where the value is, but it's also where the risk is. So I wanted to share this way of thinking about Cynefin, and we'll get to Cynefin in a moment, but for those of you who are familiar with it, you're probably seeing that grey shape behind the words and recognising it, okay? So that's the Cynefin diagram, and then we'll talk about it in a slightly different way. So, hands up if you've got a camera on your phone. Hands up if you're old enough to have owned one of those first ever camera phones, you know, when Nokia started really popularising it. Some of us, yeah? My mum's still got one of the Nokia phones that doesn't have a camera on. The brick, you know, which has the 3-day battery life. It sounds impossible now when you think about it. One of the first people to make camera phones was Kyocera, one of the early ones, and they actually pointed the video camera towards the user. They thought people would use it for video cameras, you know, as a video camera for making video calls. And they hadn't seen that, first of all, the internet wouldn't support that, and secondly, that people were much more interested in making duck faces into it, you know. So that hadn't really... They made these discoveries when they first did it. And what Nokia found was that actually people were trying to take photos with the phone, and it was much more suitable for taking photos back then than for making video calls. So when Nokia did it, what they did is they spoiled the differentiator, and they started putting cameras which actually worked really well and playing off the discoveries that have been made to actually make those cameras work in the first place, until, you know, we've all got cameras on our phones. So if I've got a camera, I'm making the world's first ever camera phone, what else do I need to do aside from anything that's got anything to do with pictures? What else do I need to do that doesn't involve pictures of the camera? Any ideas?
Make a phone. Make a phone?
Make a phone call, right? You need to be able to make a phone call and receive a phone call. And that's fairly boring because we already know how to do that. David Anderson, who gave me this model, he calls them table stakes. The things you need just to be able to play the game. So if you were going into the mobile phone market around the time of the first camera phones, you'd still need to be able to make a call, receive a call, look up numbers, etc. Nowadays, you also need a camera on your phone. So it's moved from being differentiating to being spoiled by Nokia to becoming a commodity. And this is a thing we see frequently in innovation. Devs, you're probably most familiar with this. If I ask you to do something boring over and over and over again, you automate, right? There's a great comic where this ex-KCD stick figure character says, "Hey mate, pass the salt." And the guy on the other end of the table is like silent. He says, "Mate, I asked you to pass the salt 5 minutes ago. What are you doing?" He says, "I'm just making you a machine to pass you an arbitrary condiment whenever you ask for it. It'll be quicker in the long run." Right? Devs hate doing the same things over and over and over and over again. And if we already know how to make a phone call, and then somebody goes, "Can you write me the software which lets me make a phone call again?" you end up creating libraries, you end up creating open source. And open source is quite frequently driven by the desire to never have to do that stupid thing that I keep having to do on every single project again. Right? So we looked at these types of software. There are two more types of software that I want to cover briefly, just so you can understand how this works. One is expedited stuff. So we've looked at differentiators. Expedited stuff is accident and emergency. It's when you've got your urgent production bugs, right? So Night Trading ended 2012, released something to production that was duplicating their trades. And they lost $13 billion before they worked out what it was and switched it off. You can bet that got expedited pretty quickly, yeah, and pretty fiercely. There's another type of software which exercises little things that are very, very predictable, very easy to solve. So I just wanted to get these in your heads. If you've had solved kind of Roman numerals, turning numbers into Roman numerals, or the bowling game kata. You know, so a kata is normally a martial arts exercise that you do over and over to perfect your art. We frequently do them because they're predictable, because we can tell whether we've got them right to hone our craft as devs. So those are the different types of software. Now I'm going to show you how they relate to Cynefin. Cynefin is not just relevant to devs. Cynefin is relevant to 7 billion people on this planet. The guys who came up with it, Dave Snowden and Cognitive Edge, and they use it extensively. They're trying to solve problems like improving the robustness of Singapore society, helping the Aboriginals in Australia adopt a better diet so that they don't get diabetes and alcoholism, helping the Mexican communities divorce themselves from the drug dealers. Those are the kind of problems they're trying to solve with this. And this is a really simple framework. It's completely changed the way I look at the world. And I'm really hoping that it will help you to see the world in a slightly different way as well. So it's an approach to different problems depending on how predictable they are. So the first type of problem we look at is simple problems. And here, like the Carters, you can categorise it. You can go, oh, it's one of those problems. And children can often solve them. They've actually renamed this to obvious. So even if it's a problem which requires some expertise, because you have the expertise, you look at it and you go, oh, that's obvious, I understand. I can see exactly what the problem is there. Yeah? So if your chain falls off your bicycle, you put it back on again. Right? You just look at it, you go, oh, okay, I can see how to solve that, you put it back on again. We then have more complicated problems. So if you guys remember jigsaws, when you were a kid, you get these 6-piece jigsaws, all with wood and little handles so you can put them into a board, yeah? The first ever jigsaws you do. But as you get older, you start picking up more and more complicated jigsaws. And if you're like me and my family, you end up as a family doing them over the table at Christmas. And they're 1,000-piece jigsaws. What's a good way to do a 1,000-piece jigsaw? Anyone know?
With the edges.
Start at the edges, start at the corners. Yep, start at the corners, start at the edges. Absolutely. What's another way to do it? If you've got lots of people all joining in. You can take a colour. You can take a shape, like I'll do Santa Claus. So with the simple stuff, we find we have best practices for solving a problem. But as it gets more complicated, we find that there are lots of good practices for solving the problem. So anytime anybody says best practices and is talking about software development, they've already got some issues, right? So for complicated stuff, I always think of things which require expertise but are very, very predictable. So user registration is a really good example. It's a form, you're going to collect some details from a user and register the user. You're probably going to get their password. Logging in via Active Directory. Yeah? It requires expertise, but it's predictable. We know exactly what the outcome's going to be. It just takes a little bit of work and a little bit of knowledge. But then we have these things which are complex. They're emergent. In the complex domain, cause and effect can only be correlated in retrospect. So you can see where you ended up and look back and understand how you got there. But you absolutely cannot predict that that will be the case. My favourite example of this is a company called Ludicrous. They created a game called Never Ending, big multiplayer online game, and they wanted to get more people to come play this game. So what they did, they set up a site where people could share screenshots of the game, you know. We will share screenshots of the game and people see how amazing the game is, they'll come and play the game. And so people started sharing the screenshots and photos of kittens and holiday snaps and, you know, other images that people like to put on the internet, and it became Flickr. That's how Flickr started. It was an MMO. It was a game. And you can look back and understand it. They made the best API for sharing photographs that you could possibly imagine, you know, best interface, best user interface. We never had anything like that before. But you couldn't have predicted it based on where they were. I worked for briefly with an astrology site that's now a payments gateway provider, and they couldn't predict that either. So. You get these emergent outcomes. Those of you who are familiar with, you know, you show your UI to people, and they go, oh, that's not quite going to work. And you experiment with a ton of stuff, and eventually you get it working, and you end up in a place which is really good, but it's not where you would have predicted yourselves ending up if you had just started with analysing and planning. So analysis works really, really well in the complicated domain. Expertise works really well in the complicated domain. But in the complex domain, we have to do what's called probe. We have to experiment. We've got to try things out. So that fourth domain down there is called chaos. And the chaotic domain, this is accident and emergency. This is people bleeding to death. You have to act really quickly. You have to throw some constraints around the problem, stop it. And it will resolve itself pretty quickly, and it might not resolve itself in your favour. Ron Jeffries said, you know, okay, in complex domain you do stuff that's safe to fail. That's what makes it an experiment. Why would you not do that in chaos? He said, well, if your house is burning down and you try and get out of your house and you fail, it's not safe to fail, but it's not going to stop you from trying. Chaos is usually a bad place to be because it might not resolve itself in your favour. Right? And it is going to resolve itself quickly. And your trick is to lose as little as possible, to act quickly enough that you stem that blood flow. You are probably going to suffer if you're in chaos. And most of what we do is designed to try and avoid chaos. This domain in the middle is called disorder. And disorder is the state of not knowing which of these four domains dominates. So we behave according to our preferred domain. For devs, making the salt passing machine, you know, we're definitely complex domain people. We really like trying things out and getting feedback on it and producing stuff that's new. Where do you think estimates work best? Do you think they work best over on the complex side or over on the complicated side where things are predictable? The complicated side. And yet, the reason why we're doing the projects is because it's complex. So we're sitting in our planning meetings asking how long things are going to take, and sometimes our answer is, well, it's new. We've never done this before. Nobody's ever done this before. We have no idea how long it's going to take because nobody's ever done this before. And we said, well, can you pick a number, you know, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13? And you're like, If you ever get in that position, there's a site called estimategoat.com where you can rub the goat and it'll give you a number. You can use that, okay? Honestly, if you're experimenting, do a spike time box it. That's the only way that you can actually start getting feedback on how long it's going to take. And if people are demanding certainty in a place where there really isn't any, teach them this. Make them stop doing that. At the bottom, there's this little cliff edge, like a sheet that's folded over. And along that border between simplicity and chaos, we have complacency. So as we become complacent, it's really easy to tip from simplicity into chaos. It's really hard to get back the other way. You normally have to throw some constraints around the problem, get into the complex domain, and then move around. So just to summarise those 5 domains, I'm just going to summarise the main 4 of that. Simple, you can categorise a problem, it's obvious, just solve it. Complicated stuff requires expertise, analysis works. Complex stuff, you're going to try things out and experiment, and chaos, you're going to act. And that gives you 4 really clear, different approaches to problems. We have continually been told in Agile for years to just use one process. We kind of knew that that wasn't the case in chaos. In chaos, we've always behaved very differently anyway, because we're panicking and people are screaming and yelling and oh, you know. But for the other 3 different ways of approaching the problem. You don't really need to get feedback for stuff that's in simplicity. It's just going to work. You're going to use a library. It's going to be fine. Right? I wanted to talk very quickly to you guys about the shallow dive into chaos. This is something I think this is probably the first time I've covered it in a talk. Dave Snowden covers it quite a lot. Frequently when we get together in a group, we try to come to consensus. And this is a thing that human beings do whether they mean to or not. And we don't always come to consensus in the most rational way. We listen to the most charismatic person in the room, the most dominant person in the room. We go with whoever spoke first. So I'm doing a training thing over WebEx with some guys in the States. I do remote training. And I said to them, name one way people come to consensus, put it in the chat window. And the first person said voting, and the second person said polling, and the third person said, yeah, I'll go with polling as well. And I was giggling, and they were like, why are you giggling? I said, do you see what you just did? Did you see what you just did? That. So sometimes, if you want to avoid coming to this false consensus, if you want ideas to experiment with, if you want to get a wide variety of opinions, if you want to know what's really in the room, separate people into individuals or small homogeneous groups, which is completely the opposite of Scrum's cross-functional team. Get the devs in a group, the BAs in a group, the testers in a group, the project managers in a group. Get them to come up with ideas together, or get people to brainstorm the ideas on their own. We're used to doing this with planning poker cards. We make people pick up their planning poker cards and then share them so they don't influence each other, right? But you can do this with any ideas. Whenever you're trying to harvest ideas for experiments, this is a really good way to do it. If you're ever in a meeting where you've got kind of this analysis paralysis going on, every question opens up a ton more questions, you've been in there 2.5 hours and it's just experts arguing with each other. Instead of sitting there listening to this for 2.5 hours when you could be coding, right? Suggest some experiments, or suggest that you brainstorm some experiments. You split into smaller groups and see if you can solve the problem in smaller groups, and then come back and bring your ideas for solutions. Bring your ideas for trying things out. I have successfully cut down at least 3 clients who had those 2.5-hour meetings to no more than an hour. Works really, really well. So I wanted to share a little thing that I created, which has helped people actually get a handle on this a lot better. And this is this scale I call complexity estimation, and it's fairly unambivalent. So when you're looking at the Cynefin diagram, those borders are blurry, right? These borders, things move around on them. They're not quadrants. If you call them quadrants, Snowden gets really upset. They're domains. And things can be more complex, they can be more complicated, they can be close to simplicity. So I wanted to create this scale just because, for me, it's fairly unarguable. 5, nobody in the world has ever done this before. It is new, it is going to be high discovery. 4, someone in the outside of our organisation has done it, probably a competitor. So this is like, Kyocera make the camera phone, your Nokia, you're stealing it and copying it and doing it a little bit better, right? But you don't know how long it took them, or who came out the woodwork to stop them, or what kind of discoveries they made. You have no idea. All you know is they managed it. So it's still very high discovery. 3, someone in the company's done it before, or you have access to expertise, you can get a book, you can read it on YouTube. 2, someone in the team's done it before, and 1, we all know how to do it. And here's how I laid them out. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So you can see that 5s and 4s, you're going to have to experiment with those. The 3s, brilliant place to actually do analysis. 2s, 1s, don't worry about too much. It's going to work. So here's some examples. Self-driving cars, mild vision, and that latest music app, those are all, things which are fairly new, and you can see things like Songkick, Spotify, they're getting there. Mending watches, GPS user registration we mentioned. Dates, it turns out, sorry, it's got a ghost in the machine again. Dates, it turns out, are weird if you're in the energy business, because it turns out that when you have some days which are 23 hours and some days which are 25 hours, and that differs from one country to another, and you're buying electricity across the border, it actually requires some expertise to know what you mean by day, and they have some very, very specific definitions of different types of day, so that they can avoid that problem. So you actually have to have some expertise for that. And then you've got anything, honestly, don't be doing Cynefin if you're in chaos, right? You know you're in chaos, you can abandon everything else and merely act to throw some constraints around the problem so that you can try and solve it. Okay, so here is a note for the devs and particularly for testers in the room. Any testers here? A few testers? I teach a lot of BDD, and I started hearing this, we can't accept things into our backlog without clear acceptance criteria. If the business aren't certain what they want, and they don't really know, and they can't phrase the acceptance criteria, it's entirely possible that it's because it's new, and they're not really sure what it's going to look like, and they've never tried it before. If you push back and insist that they analyse it some more, it takes all the risk and it pushes it to the end of the project, when you have less time to respond to those discoveries. And that's what causes the weekend and the evening work. So it's really in your interest not to do this. If they're not sure, ask, is it because it's new? Or is it because we need some expertise? Or is it because you genuinely aren't the right person to be talking to? If it's because it's new, embrace that. Think of some ways that you could actually do something to get some feedback, try something out. Think of 3 ways you could do something to try it out, right? That's called concurrent set-based engineering. Data only calls it parallel experiments. And you can tell in retrospect which ones of them work. Make sure they're safe to fail. Okay, that's Cynefin. I was showing Cynefin to a group of people that weren't software. They were developing a target operating model. And this one guy said, well, that's really interesting, without me prompting. He said, the 4s and 5s, that's where the value is. I went, yes. He said, that's where the risk is. I said, yes. He said, so we should be doing those first. And I said, yes. And he said, but the whole of the industry does it the other way round. I said, yes. Yes, they do. So I'm now teaching this. This is how I actually go about setting up a project, helping people plan, helping people, and I really like MVPs. I'm very into lean. I like tiny projects that you just release something and learn from. I really love lean startup. Frequently when I go into organisations, they don't have incremental budgeting, they have really big budgets still. They can say they're agile, but they do have the really big budgets, and with the really big budgets, you know, with great budgets comes great analysis. So there's some constraints around what they have in terms of analysis, and it still works there. It works for either kind of environment. It's based on something my friend Chris Matz told me. He created this thing called feature injection, which Dan North swears blind he didn't come up with the name for. We're not sure how it came about, but it's a terrible name. But the idea is you only inject features into a project because you need them. And Chris describes it as hunt the value, right? Find that thing that's risky, find that thing that's new. He's renaming it to value mapping. I took a completely different slant on it based on how he taught it to me, and this is the results. So this is capability ready. Every project has a vision, something which is going to make money, save money, or protect your existing revenue. Okay? And there is usually a primary stakeholder, somebody who fought for that budget, somebody who's really championing the project. I am continually astounded by how many projects the devs don't even know who that person is. I look back on the projects I did that I had no idea who that person was. Find out who that person is. If you can, have a chat with them, get them to articulate what that vision was, the thing that they really want. If they haven't done it for the entire group, get them in, get them to talk about it. This is the thing you're trying to get. Everything else is there because it also needs to make calls, receive calls, etc. Okay? So as well as this primary stakeholder, you have these incidental secondary stakeholders. And they have goals which need to be met in order for you to go live. So for instance, if we're working at The Guardian and we're adding a comment form to an article, there's a moderator of the site who needs to keep the content interesting. The legal guys need to stop any libelous comments. We need to be able to report spam, stuff like that. So that the incidental stakeholders have this goal, keep the content interesting. And to keep the content interesting, we have these things we're going to be able to do, able to report spam, right? These are capabilities. I used to call them themes and feature sets. So if you read any of the old literature, I should have actually changed this on this slide, it says themed feature sets. I now call these capabilities. They're grouped together because these are the things which enable you to do something. A business analyst is somebody who can analyse that aspect of the business. Right? It's just a role. These are just roles, they're not people. When I do BDD, we like to talk in terms of scenarios. So we'll talk in terms of an example of somebody using our system. You know, I can go to a cash machine, I can ask for £20 and it will give me £20. That's an example of me using the cash machine to get a specific amount of money. I really love talking in terms of capabilities. It stops people worrying about the code. Devs, if you have a problem with worrying too much about the code, and as soon as I mention anything like that, you're imagining the software in the cash machine, it's not software, it's pixies. Okay, it's little people. If you've ever read Terry Pratchett's books, when he takes a picture with a camera, there's a little gnome or goblin inside who paints the picture and sticks it out the front. And Two-Flower, who's got the camera, looks at it and he says, "Oh, that's a funny colour." He says, "Yeah, sorry, I ran out of blue." Right? It's like that. There is a little person in the cash machine who's going to stick the money out. There is a little person in your computer who's painting frantically on the screen and telepathically sending messages to other pixies elsewhere. If you imagine it that way, don't worry about how it's going to work. What you're worrying about is what's going to do. Right? So we're looking at what it is we're trying to achieve, not how we're going to achieve it. Right up until we actually decide how we're going to achieve it. We are going to stop bots from spamming our site by using a capture box. Okay? So hands up, who does user stories? As a user, I want, yeah? As a user, oh, look at that, loads of people. As a user, I want to fill in a capture box, so wait, no, I don't. as you go into your bank account, you get 20 quid out the cash machine. As a user, I want the bank to debit my account, so no. A lot of these things are not for the benefit of the users. And this is why identifying the stakeholders is so very important. When we focus on the users all the time, we forget there are other people whose needs need to be met as well. And sometimes it's not the UI that's the differentiating thing, that's the valuable thing. Sometimes it's something else at the back end. Hands up if you've been on a replacement legacy project, you're replacing a legacy system, right, with one that's more maintainable. And because it's loss leading, the first thing that happens is people make you do it faster, so you cut corners and produce a legacy system. Because you lost sight of the differentiator, because you focused on the functionality. If you're in that position, get some code quality metrics around it. A story is just a slice or a feature so we can fit it into a sprint, so that we can get feedback more quickly, right? And the teams which focus on getting feedback are generally way more successful than the ones that focus on getting accurate estimates. If you tweet anything, you can tweet that today. I don't think anyone has yet. And then we write code. And I said I've done this with non-software teams. The people who are turning these ideas into reality, the people who are producing the artifacts, take the equivalent of a coder. Okay? So if you're ever doing it with non-software teams, this does work. We were looking at differentiators, and sometimes when we look at that initial vision, we're asking why. We're going, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? I found there are some better ways of not sounding like a 5-year-old in the back of the car. So I asked what will be different compared to what we already have. What will you get? What will it get for you that you don't already have? This is one I picked up from NLP. We call it chunking up. So when people are describing their problem and I want this thing, you say, okay, what will that get for you that you don't have already? What will you or the users or the systems be able to do that you can't do already? And this is the red bit of capability red, right? So it's a capability, the ability to do something that you can't do. If you can already make calls and receive calls, those things are green. User registration is green. You've already got user registration. You just need to do it again because you're moving platforms. It's not the thing you should be focusing on. It's not the thing that's failing. You know, when you write the red, green refactor, you always write a failing test. This is a high-level failing test. What do you have that's red, that isn't green in the organisation, that you've never done before? What's that different new thing? So the etymology of capability means to grasp and catch hold of and seize. And I always think of it as, it's not just being able to do something, it's being able to do something really well. It's being able to embrace it, to know that you're going to do it in all of the circumstances that you have deliberately chosen to do it in. So you can choose which scenarios to address. You can choose which personas to go for. So I come up with these capabilities for a project, and I'll talk a little bit more about how I do that. But then we put complexity estimates on them. And when you've got those, you can then look at the capability and you know exactly how to address them. Sorry, I've got to go to the machine again. So high discovery, suitable for spikes and prototypes, right, 5s and 4s. A 3 means you're going to need expertise. BDD works really well here, and analysis works really well here. I recommend getting feedback, especially as it heads towards complexity, because you're human beings and we make mistakes. Okay? As you go into 2s and 1s, use a library, buy it off the shelf, do as little as possible. If you're doing it for yourself, make it into a service. And as things become better and better understood, so they become more and more commoditized, this is where the microservices architecture is so useful. When you understand something, turn it into a microservice, farm it off, don't worry about it. Right? So somebody told me this looks just like the Kano model. It does, except that it relates to BDD as well, so I'm going to show you how this actually plays into BDD. Devs get it. Devs can handle 5 numbers. Right? We can draw it up on a board, and people generally remember after the first few iterations what the 5 numbers are, and then the various approaches that go with them. Devs really get this. And what happens is that devs who get it start offering experiments to the business. They start saying, well, look, we could do this little thing for you, and you could look at it and get some feedback on it. And then suddenly, the business and IT are starting to become innovation partners instead of a cost centre, which means the devs get to do more exciting work. It's as much about stakeholders as requirements. So when I identify the stakeholders, I frequently put the 4s and 5s on the people. Who's the person we've never made happy before in this organisation? Who's the person we're engaging with in a new way? Who's the person that we're delivering this project to? I'll talk a little bit more about identifying stakeholders in a moment. And you can use it for stuff that isn't software, right? You can use this with just about any project that you go into. Work out what the newest bit that you've never done before is, and think of a way to experiment and try something out cheaply before you go putting massive loads of investment into it. And if you honestly can't think of anything that's new, because it's all boring and all really well understood, find a way to make it repeatable so you don't have to worry about it. I get an accountant to do my accounts now. I really hate accounts. And I can give her all my receipts and she will type in my receipts and I know she'll get them right. Because she doesn't find that boring and I really do. A little bit of a note. Some capabilities are what I call continuous. So performance, security, things which always have to be true for the entire project, maintainability, code quality. If you can't write a test for it, because it's got to be true for absolutely everything, write monitoring for it. Or put a step into your process, a code review, something like that, which monitors how you're doing. Monitor the number of people using your code, using your software. Okay? So that's what you do with the discrete capabilities. You can include them in exactly the same way. And put some numbers on it. Tom Guild, with his Evo stuff, has a load of really, really great ways of getting way more rigor than I can talk about in this session. But he had put some numbers on it. What's more quickly? Is 5 minutes good? Okay, 5 minutes is good. That would be a significant improvement. You'd love that. Brilliant. Let's go for 5 minutes. Would you accept 10 minutes? Okay, how long does it take right now? 15? So you'd accept 10 minutes. 12? No, 12 isn't worth it. Okay, so we're on about 10 for the minimum standard. So this is how he does it, right? He goes for target and a minimum threshold. And if the thing you're doing is not the differentiator, be happy when you hit that minimum threshold. If you happen to go beyond it, fantastic. Well done. But if you've done enough effort to get to that minimum threshold, stop, move on to the next thing. Okay, we're getting out just what we need. Who's old enough to remember this? Fewer of us. Wow. What is it, guys? Asteroids. It's asteroids. So this is a computer game that I used to play back in the BBC microcomputers. So you're a little spaceship. That little triangle in the middle is a spaceship, and you hit these big asteroids. What happens to the big asteroids? They turn into smaller ones. How do the smaller ones move compared to the bigger ones?
Faster.
They're faster, right? And what's happened to when you hit the medium-sized asteroids?
They split up and get smaller.
Split up into even smaller ones. How do they move?
Faster.
Really, really quick in comparison, right? So you get this increasingly small things that are moving really quickly. How do you die when you first start playing this game, if you're me?
You hit all the big
You shoot
ones.
all the big ones and then all the medium ones, and you've got tiny, tiny little things whizzing around the screen, and one of them hits you out of nowhere and then you're dead, right? If you wouldn't do that with the asteroids, don't do that with your stories. Don't break everything down all at once. If everything broke down, you'd get this lovely, beautiful thing, and we'd all go and we'd talk about how fantastic that project was, how amazing it was. We don't do that. We talk about the discoveries we make. Breaking everything down up front is waterfall. To break everything down works for complicated stuff. You know, a watchmaker can take a watch apart, he can put it back together again, he knows exactly how it's going to work. And mechanical stuff we tend to be able to do that with. But trying things out works for the complex stuff. So we're not going to be able to break something that's a 5 or 4 down into its constituent parts. That's simply not going to work. start with the 5s and 4s, try something out, create an experiment. And before you ask why, ask who are we doing this for? Identify the person and get feedback from them. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I identify all the stakeholders that need to be included, because you need to include them for the 3s and the 2s and 1s as well. I look at the dev team, and I go in as a consultant and I say, okay, well, who gives the requirements to the dev teams? Is it the users? The users can just talk straight to the devs, put something in the devs queue. Oh no, okay, it turns out there's a company board and they had a feasibility study, and that feasibility study had to be funded by the feasibility funding board, and then there was, the PMO guys prioritise amongst the things which have had feasibility studies, and you can find out it's been 6 months of analysis work that got done before the dev team got a sniff at the project. And all of these people have things that they've considered, things that they want. And then going out the other way, you say, okay, well, can the devs just release to production? No? Okay, who's going to stop them from releasing to production? Oh, UAT might, the ops team might, the architects might decide it's not maintainable enough, you've got security guys, you've got some legal guys, and you look out, going out. Now, here's the trick. First thing I do when I walk in as a consultant, hands up if you're a coach or consultant here. So a few of you, so this is for the 3 of you, okay? Ask the person when you've drawn this to map the boundary of their influence. It's really, really handy. The constraint will always be outside of the boundary. So the problems they're facing really will actually be outside the boundary. And if you're improving things within that boundary, all you're going to do is hit the outside harder. So get the guy inside the boundary to make friends with the person on the outside. That's the constraint, okay? Because you're going to end up hitting it quite hard and then the devs will get really miserable. And we don't like miserable devs. I don't like being a miserable devs. I like miserable devs, sorry, I should clarify that. I just feel sad when I see them because it's so unnecessary. The second trick, if any of your stakeholders are 5s, 4s or 3s, or the capabilities you're delivering them to them are, bring them in as educators instead of gatekeepers. Get them to talk to you while you're still doing the project, while it's still safe to fail. Right? This is what we do with BDD. We bring the testers in ahead of doing the code to help us spot scenarios we miss. You can do the same thing with any gatekeeping stakeholder. Architects, legal guys. Tell the architects, okay, what are you going to do before you let us go live? What measurements are you going to be making? What are the kind of things you're going to be looking at? And it will educate the team. So when you've got that, draw up the capabilities that are related to all your stakeholders. Don't forget the integration points. These are known unknowns. So complex space is unknown unknowns. The chaotic space is unknowable unknowns. You can't possibly know what's going on until you actually come out of chaos and into complexity. And then you have unknown unknowns. Put complexity estimates on your 4s and 5s. They are your unknown unknowns. This is why they're really high discovery. But they're also because they're new. Right? So pay particular attention to those. See if you can narrow it down. So if you can release something small, if you can pick on one of those 4s or 5s and say, well look, we could get this new innovative thing out if we just had just these other things. That's how you can get an MVP. Companies with very high transaction costs for going live, and we all start out where we start out, they might not be able to do this. They might have really good reasons for releasing 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 differentiating things at once. I try and draw the limit at about 3. It's going to take a year for most big organisations. That's not very agile, but we start where we start. If it's useful, put estimates on them. I did this with big German energy company, about as bureaucratic as you can get. I said, which is the smallest? Okay, call that 20. Which is the biggest? Okay, call it 400. Is there one in the middle that's about 200? Great. And from that you can then rank the rest. So you just put those 3 in as rails, as stake posts, and you can rank the rest. Keeps peer markers happy. They can see and get some idea of progress, which is way better than waterfall when they really didn't. Double the 4s and 5s. Take every estimate they've done for the 4s and 5s and say you're going to double them unless they can tell you why not. If they can say, well, it's only this tiny little bit, it's only this tiny ability that we're going to give it to this new group of users that we've not addressed previously, but it's really small. Well, fantastic. Let's make that a capability on its own and do that bit first. Right? So you can split the capabilities up just by doing that, by saying, well, double it unless you can ask me, unless you can tell me why not. Take the highest level capabilities, and then you move them onto your storyboard. You give them a swim lane each. So if you're familiar with Kanban, swim lane's just a horizontal thing on your vertical columns of your board. And you can start breaking them down there. And just start peeling off stories. And I generally let the dev team decide how they want to slice it up. Ideally, one risky scenario that, get that working, get some feedback on it, do something where you can get feedback at the end of your 2 weeks when all the stakeholders come to have a look. It's really engaging. And you don't need to worry about having something that's incomplete if you can get feedback on it, because complete is everything you're going to ship. We always talk about these, shippable value. If we could ship a 5 or 4 on its own with nothing else, we would. But we sometimes need those commoditized stuff as well. So the only way of prioritising, if you can't prioritise by value, is to prioritise by risk. So you might as well do those 4s and 5s first. So here's what it looks like if you do it that way. Goals, capabilities, I've actually moved scenarios up since I did this slide. But pick the smallest thing that will let you look at that risk. The smallest experiment you could do to start getting some feedback, start getting some ideas. Okay, how are we doing for time?
15 minutes left.
Sorry?
15 minutes left.
15 minutes left, perfect. Okay, so this is the bit that I've been talking about for the longest, been doing BDD for 10 years. Hands up if you're familiar with behaviour-driven development. Keep your hands up if you don't use Cucumber. Fantastic. Okay, all the rest of you, I'm really hoping you started with the conversations. For me, the conversations are at the heart of BDD, and hopefully at the end of this you'll understand why that's the case, why I tend to steer away from Cucumber, at least to start with, until you're really good at having those conversations. BDD works really, really well in the complicated space. If you try to do it and try to talk through scenarios, can you give me an example of how we make a phone call? Bored, right? We don't want to do that. We don't want to talk about user registration again. It's really familiar. Dan North's got a pattern he uses instead. He calls it ginger cake. So if you're making ginger cake and you already know how to make chocolate cake backwards, take the recipe, take the chocolate out, put some ginger in. Job done, right? You might want to try out a few little cakes just to see whether different levels of ginger give you something. Experiment with it that way. But you don't need to analyse how to make a cake when you already know how to make a cake. So this is a really boring scenario in BDD. We normally use this given, when, then template for BDD. But honestly, if you just want to start talking to people, you can just say, can you give me an example? And however they phrase it, it'll be good. I frequently find people don't really give me specific examples. So I'll say, give me an example of how to use Word, and they say, well, when I select text, it should be and make it italic, it should appear in italics. And I said, okay, give me an example of some text you want to make italic. And they say, lost dog. I've lost a dog, and I want lost dog to appear in italics, or answers to spot to appear in italics. It's like, that's way more interesting than describing how Word works, right? So you've got something you can engage with. So we try to make these specific little examples. Give them Fred bought a microwave. Microwave costs £100. When we refund the microwave, Fred should be refunded £100. Boring. We know how to do this. This is refunds. We've all gone to the shop and got a refund. This is actually a fairly predictable problem. This is the problem which has been solved. This is really boring. Logging in. We used to use this as an example in the early days of BDD. I'm really sorry about that. This was partly my fault. It's really boring. We don't want to talk about that. Hands up if you use Cucumber. There's a few people, okay. This is really, really boring. This is on the front page of Cucumber. Adding two numbers together. A scenario in which you add two numbers together. Because you really need to talk to a domain expert about that and make sure it gets captured, right? ASAC has agreed to change this for something a little more meaningful. You wouldn't talk through a scenario like this. It'd be pointless. You wouldn't do analysis on something like this. You just say we need a library that can add some numbers together. Let's call it maths. Let's just use maths. If I ever come across something like this, a trick I use is just name the scenarios. So if you've got user registration, just as a check, just to make sure, you can go, okay, well, we've got the scenarios, create a user, we've got the one where we read or update a user's details, and we've got the one where we delete a user. Is there anything different about those three? Remember, we're always focusing on trying to find things which are different. So anything different about creating a user, updating a user, deleting a user. And if you're Blizzard, you say, yeah, when people ask for their account to be deleted, we don't actually delete it, we keep it for a while, and then every 6 months we email them and say, come back to World of Warcraft, we still have all your characters, and I go, no, 5 years clean. Okay. But that's how you can find out whether it's something different. And frequently you find there's some other scope. So, account recovery, yeah, that's new. We need to talk about how to recover characters when their guild's been deleted and somebody else has stolen the character name, and etc. So the implications, this is an interesting scenario, okay? Fred bought a 120 kilogram fridge freezer and wants a refund. He didn't bring it into the store on his shoulder. It's a 120 kilo fridge freezer. It's still back at his house. So just by looking for a different context, we suddenly find there's some uncertainty there. What are we going to do? Are we going to give him the refund when he comes into the store, then go and collect the fridge freezer and find the house is empty and he's scarpered? Are we going to go and check the fridge and send our workman out at our cost and then find he didn't know how to plug it in? This is a solved problem, but I don't know how they solved it. And I guarantee the first people who allowed for refunds to be automated made a ton of discoveries around it. Because it was new, because it was something you'd never done before. So if you're doing BDD and you start encountering this uncertainty, where the business go, I haven't thought of that, I don't know, embrace it. Congratulations, you've just used BDD for the very thing it was really intended for, discovering uncertainty and embracing uncertainty. And that's why the conversations are way more important than the automated tests. Final note. If your stakeholders don't trust you, that is the biggest risk that you can possibly be facing. And sometimes if your organisation has a bit of a dysfunctional IT business relationship, that can be the case. If you find yourself in that situation, don't go for the risky stuff first because it might not work. Instead, take something that's a little bit more predictable and show that you can deliver. Find ways of getting their trust. As soon as you reckon you've got their trust, start bringing in some of the risky stuff. Because there is nothing like addressing the stuff that stops a stakeholder sleeping at night for helping gain that. That's it. Thank you very much.